Okay, today we actually finish up with the nematoda, the roundworms, and we may not, but if there's time, we'll get to one more phylum that's not nematodes, but superficially looks a lot like them. It's called the Nematomorpha. So we've talked about the two classes of nematodes. Class Chromadoria includes many non-parasitic species, but also includes the order Rhabditida, which includes Tylencana, Rhabditina, and Spirurina. We started with the Spirurina last time, and Ascaridomorpha is the big intestinal parasites like Ascaris, human and pig and other intestinal roundworm, and arrowworms like Toxocara and Toxoscaris, which you'd see in dogs and cats. And Oxyuridomorpha includes the pinworms. They also include the cockroach symbionts that we looked at in the very first lab 15 years ago, and human intestinal pinworm, probably the most prevalent parasitic infection in the West. Today we'll finish looking at the Spiruromorpha and Gnathostomatomorpha. Spiruromorpha includes filarial worms, and you've seen these in lab because I had you look at the slide of larval Dirofilaria, the canine heartworm. And Gnathostomatomorpha includes Dracunculoidea, which includes Dracunculus, the Guinea worm, one of the more horrifying human parasite infections, but also one that has almost been driven to extinction. So in the Spiruromorph group, Filaroidea, these are tissue-dwelling worms that have an arthropod as an intermediate host. And instead of being spread by the fecal-oral route, these are spread by arthropod bites. The one in particular is spread by the bite of black flies, flies in the family Simulidae, which you might have heard of if you're taking entomology. Adult filaroids usually live in blood or lymphatic vessels. And Wucheria bancrofti, shown here as the most common human filaroid. Remember that filaria or filariform refers to nematodes that travel in the bloodstream or sometimes in the lymphatic vessels. And this group, the Filaroidea, does this all the time, although we've seen this in some non-filaroid nematodes like hookworm. This is one that's transmitted by mosquitoes. Mosquitoes pick up microfilaria larvae with a blood meal, and it's easy because they are only 7 to 10 microns wide. They are, I don't know what the record is for the smallest member of the animal kingdom, but these must surely be close. So they'll pick them up with a blood meal. The larvae molt twice in the mosquito, and then when the mosquito feeds, the larvae at the J3 stage are deposited on the skin. They're not actually injected. They're not injected the way malaria is, but they're deposited on the skin and then crawl into the bite wound, penetrate into the host body, and travel to the lymphatic system. Remember, I'm sure you know this, but if you don't have much of a background of human anatomy, you know, we have the circulatory system, but there is an entirely different system of vessels through which a fluid called lymph flows. It's called the lymphatic system or the lymphatic ducts. They connect up lumps of tissue called lymph nodes, and the lymphatic system actually drains into the circulatory system through what's called the thoracic duct, which I believe drains into your vena cava, the main blood vessel leading into the heart. The newly hatched larvae, this is the stage that would be in a human that's picked up by a mosquito, they actually retain the egg membrane as a sheath. You can see over on the right-hand side, there is something that looks a little bit like a crumpled piece of paper over on the right-hand side. That's part of the egg membrane. Those dark dots are individual cell nuclei. Their arrangement is important for identifying what species you've got. You might remember that Caenorhabditis elegans, a free-living nematode, has a fixed number and arrangement of cells. And I don't know if that's true of every nematode, but it certainly seems to be true for Wucheria here. Okay, the adults sometimes will develop in blood vessels, but usually where they hang out is lymphatic vessels and lymph nodes. Here you've got stained cross sections through lymph nodes. And the kind of irregular oval looking objects that you're seeing in cross section, that slices through the nematode bodies. They're just kind of curled up in there inside those lymph nodes. They reproduce. They release larvae, which, if you remember, are still wrapped in that egg membrane, and the larvae travel into the bloodstream via the thoracic duct. Remember, that's the duct that connects your lymphatic system to the circulatory system. Lymph ultimately drains into your vena cava through your thoracic duct. And in most species, this is actually periodic. The larvae tend to enter the bloodstream at night, and lo and behold, that happens to be when mosquitoes are likeliest to bite you. Okay, so what's the big deal? The problem is that if your lymph vessels can't drain because of blocking or because of scarring, you can end up with this. This doesn't happen to everybody that gets infected by Wucheria, but if it's chronic, lymphatic inflammation can lead to scarring and blocking of the lymphatic ducts, and that leads to edema, swollen body parts. So this person's badly swollen legs are caused by blockage of lymph vessels in the legs. The lymph can't drain the way it's supposed to, and this can lead to a condition called elephantiasis. Now, that's not a perfectly good name, because that iasis suffix means infection by something. So, for example, infection with fly larvae is myiasis. Infection with, let me think. We've seen a couple of examples of this. Infection with whipworm would be trichioriasis. So elephantiasis should mean infection with elephants. Like you've got elephants growing in your lymph nodes or something like that, which would be kind of hard to explain to your doctor. But in fact, it means that swollen body parts reminded somebody of, elephant body parts. It doesn't actually mean you are infected with elephants in your bloodstream, although that would be pretty weird and cool. Right. And there's an estimated 40 million people worldwide that suffer from this. And as we mentioned, not every infected person develops symptoms like this. In this case, the worms weren't even present in the affected tissues. What happened here is the lymphatic system draining the scrotum and testicles was blocked by scarring and the growth of fibrous tissue. This is a man from India who had 70 pounds of mostly skin and scar tissue surgically removed. There's an estimated 40 million people suffering from elephantiasis, and that's certainly, aside from being, extremely inconvenient, it's also socially absolutely crippling. As I would imagine somebody who's got to carry his scrotum around in a wheelbarrow might have kind of a hard time making friends. And again, this is not the worms themselves so much as the immune response to worm infection. So there. Another big one, not in this country, but this is a big one in Africa, is Onchocerca volvulus, which is spread by the bite of black flies. Don't know if you've ever been bitten by black flies. I can attest from personal experience that in the Arctic and subarctic, they are extremely common and make you absolutely miserable. There are also species in Africa that transmit Onchocerca volvulus. That's spread by black fly bites. Adults live in the skin, and they cause pretty severe allergic responses. Itching, swelling, in some cases depigmentation. You can end up with patches of light skin. And then larvae can migrate to the eye, and when they do that, they cause the cornea to start clouding. If it's a mild infection, this can clear up, but if it's chronic, you can get secondary bacterial infection and scarring will set in. And if the cornea is permanently clouded, you are, of course, blind. And onchocerciasis is known as river blindness, and this is the second leading infectious cause of blindness in the world. There are international efforts underway to try to eradicate this. There is a related species that infects dogs and wolves. In fact, there are species that infect a lot of wild animals, many of which don't seem to have been very well studied. But anybody who does veterinary work at a zoo, it's possible that you might encounter species related to Onchocerca from parasitizing other species of animals as well. Here's the cool thing. This is not Onchocerca itself, it's a relative. And this is a cross-section through the body. You see the M is the label for muscle layer. And at this level of cross-section through the body, most of the space in the worm is taken up by uteruses. There's two, those empty spaces labeled with capital U. And inside the uterus on the right, you can see eggs being produced. Those are sections through three, actually, I think those are embryos developing inside eggs. And in two of them, you ought to be able to see little red staining dots. This is an immunostain of a bacterium called Wolbachia. Wolbachia is freakish and cool. Wolbachia is found in a lot of insects as well, insects and nematodes. And it's an intracellular parasite that's passed on from one generation to the next in the cytoplasm of the egg. Not you personally, you can't get Wolbachia, but infected insects and roundworms pass on Wolbachia from one generation to the next through the mother's egg cytoplasm. This has resulted in some really weird things that we don't have time to get into, like a Pacific Island butterfly that was found to have a population that turned out to be 99% female. And the reason is that Wolbachia in that species had evolved a way to either kill or feminize all of the males when they were still embryos. Because Wolbachia is only passed on through eggs, it's not to Wolbachia's advantage to end up in a male body. So Wolbachia had evolved this thing that was getting rid of all of the males in the species. It's really cool stuff. What's important for our purposes here is that Wolbachia seems to do a lot of triggering the immune system, and that's what leads to the permanent damage. It's not so much the worm, it's the immune response to the worm, or more accurately, the immune response to the bacteria living inside the worm. This is weird. We've got symbionts here that are living one inside the other like, nested Russian dolls. And it turns out that it's important clinically because you can kill Wolbachia with antibiotics that we already have. Wolbachia is susceptible to the antibiotic doxycycline, and it looks like that's effective against onchocerciasis. It's always tricky developing anti-parasite drugs because many parasites, of course, are in the animal kingdom. Certainly nematodes are, and any drug that went after nematode cells would have a pretty good shot of going after your cells because your cells are a lot like nematode cells. Antibiotics, on the other hand, target things that bacteria do that your cells don't. Penicillin, for example, targets bacterial cell walls. Since your cells don't make bacterial cell walls, penicillin is relatively very safe. So coming up with a drug that killed the nematode itself is going to be difficult because anything that kills the nematodes has a decent chance of hurting you. Doxycycline, on the other hand, goes right after the bacteria, doesn't bother you nearly as much, and the nematodes can't survive without Wolbachia. So there. We might also mention the African eyeworm, Loa loa, that's spread by deer flies. The adults of this species don't live in lymph nodes. They live in connective tissues, specifically in fascia. That's the sheets of connective tissue that hold your muscles together. Familiar if you've ever, sliced up raw meat or something like that. Severe infections cause swellings on the face and the body called Calabar swellings. And the really horrifying thing is that sometimes they migrate to the eye. So there you can see one being surgically removed. Cat, you are sleeping on the pouch. One moment, I've got to... No, you can't be there. Here. Sorry, Fern. Get yourself up here. Nice kitty. Sorry, I'm assuming you can still see me. The problem is that where the cat was sleeping knocked out power to my monitor, so I can't quite see what I'm doing. Here we go. Okay, and in this species, Loa loa, there's a microfilaria of Loa loa. They tend to hang out in the lungs, but they pass into the bloodstream during the day, and that happens to be when their intermediate host, the deer flies, are most active. In contrast with Onchocerca, where the Wucheria, where the filaria enter the bloodstream at night when mosquitoes are most active. So, this is a nematode group that's got, that is divided up into a day shift and a night shift, I guess. And then in the US, we tend not to have these human parasites, and the most familiar filaroid worm is Dirofilaria immitis, which is the cause of canine heartworm in the United States. You can get this infecting humans, but it doesn't mature sexually in humans, and it doesn't live in the human heart. But it can certainly inhabit a dog heart, and can become so numerous that it starts causing enlargement of the heart and heart failure. And this is something that veterinarians around here are very familiar with, and a reason why you're supposed to medicate your dogs to make sure that it never gets to this point. Last group I'm going to talk about, Nematomorpha, includes genus Dracunculus. Dracunculus is affectionately known as the Guinea worm. And Guinea worm goes through larval stages in crustaceans that live in drinking water, little copepods. When the copepods are swallowed by people, the juveniles burst out, develop into adults, and a mated adult female will start tunneling through the tissues and push her butt end out of the skin, causing a very painful burning blister. When a person gets an agonizing burning blister, typically on his or her leg, that person will often seek relief by soaking it in water. And when you soak it in water, the worm emerges and starts laying eggs in the water. And then the eggs hatch into juveniles that get eaten by little crustaceans. Treatment involves winding the worm out with a stick. You can see this clearly on the right. That's a matchstick that has to be turned very, very slowly. You don't want to tear the worm because that will trigger an allergic response and trigger worse pain and inflammation. So you might only be able to turn that stick maybe half a turn a day or something like that. And since the worm is 3 feet long, this can take weeks to get the worm out of the body. While the worm is coming out of the body, the patient is pretty incapacitated, can't walk very well, can't get around very well, and, may not be able to, work or go to school or otherwise provide for, a family. And may be subject to secondary infections if bacteria get into this ulcer. There's the life cycle. The larvae live in freshwater copepods. They mature when a human drinks unfiltered water. The larvae penetrate the stomach and intestinal wall, and then a fertilized female worm will migrate to the surface of the skin and create that blister. This is endemic to Africa and the Middle East, or at least it used to be. And it has been suggested that there's a Greek symbol called the rod of Asclepius. You might remember that Asclepius was the Greek god of healing. And his symbol was a rod with a snake wrapped around it. This is often confused, by the way, with the rod of Mercury, which is a rod with 2 snakes wrapped around it and also a pair of wings. Mercury was not a god of healing. He was a god of thieves. So the rod with 2 snakes and wings wrapped around it is used a lot in the pharmaceutical industry. But Asclepius's rod is just a stick with a single snake wrapped around it, and you'll see that sometimes on things like ambulance logos. And it has been suggested that the origin of this symbol is the stick being used to wind Dracunculus out of the body. There's even a passage in the Bible where, as the Israelites are wandering in the wilderness looking for the promised land, they get attacked by a plague of fiery serpents, and Moses makes a model of a brass serpent on a pole and holds it up, and anyone who sees the brass serpent is healed. It's been suggested that what this is a memory of getting infected with Dracunculus, which looks like a serpent. Dracunculus is Latin for little dragon. It looks like a serpent. It causes fiery symptoms, a burning feeling in that blister. And what Moses might have been making is a model to show the Israelites how to treat the infection. I have no idea if that's true or not. I'm not a Bible scholar, you might have noticed, but it's an interesting idea. And certainly this has been afflicting humans for a very long time. This turns out that in this case, there is a very simple way to avoid getting dracunculus. There are certainly drugs that may be able to help, but the simplest way is to filter your water. Because to get this, you have to swallow a live copepod, and the copepods are a bit less than a millimeter. So filter your water through a filter that's smaller than copepods, and you won't get dracunculus. And drinking straws with metal filters have been widely distributed in Africa for the past couple of decades. Over 23 million, probably more. This information's a couple of years old. And again, we saw this talking about malaria. It's the same thing here. These are easy to make. They're cheap to make. They can be made locally. You don't need specialized, fabrication facilities. So even undeveloped parts of Africa can usually make these. And they break the parasite's life cycle, similar to the mosquito nets that we talked about used for malaria control. At first, there was some resistance to this, but control efforts have focused on educating the local people. Here you can see they're reading a comic book about dracunculiasis. Those bandages are because they both have dracunculiasis and they've got blisters on their feet. So they're learning about it. These materials are made to fit local tastes, and getting the people on their side has also been important. At first, people were skeptical that drinking through a straw was actually going to do any good, but they'd get one village to try it. And when the people in the village realized that, hey, ever since we started using these straws, we're not getting guinea worm, they'd get some people from one village to go to the next village and essentially say, yes, I know it sounds weird, but if you drink through this straw right here that we're giving out for free, you won't get guinea worm. So one village would teach the next, and then that village would go on to the next, and so on. And so getting this to come up from the grassroots is a major part of the reason why guinea worm has almost been wiped out. Guinea worm is on track to be the second major infectious disease to be eradicated globally, smallpox being the first. In 1986, there were 3.5 million cases in every country in Africa, also in the Middle East, and I think even India. In 2015, there were 22 cases. In 2017, there were 30 cases. There were 19 in 2018, and I don't have the 2019 figures on hand. It's turning out to be a little bit trickier than just getting everybody drinking straws, because it turns out dogs can get it as well. And there are some dog populations around Lake Chad, in the country of Chad, which is the second from the left of those yellow shaded countries. That's Chad. And around that lake, you might be able to see it. Dracunculus has been able to sustain itself in local dogs as a reservoir host. So it's a little bit trickier than just getting everybody to use a drinking straw. But still, we've damn near got this guinea worm wiped out completely. It's been eradicated from almost all of Africa. And this is beginning, if we can keep it up, this is going to be a major triumph of public health, the second major infectious disease to be wiped out globally. I'm normally in favor of maintaining as much species diversity as possible, but I figure we can probably do without Dracunculus. Right. And that illustrates one of my favorite themes, the importance of not just swooping in like a savior, but getting the locals to understand what they're doing. There is probably a lesson in there for how America could have prepared for the COVID-19 epidemic a little bit better, but I'll leave you to consider that yourselves. Anyway, Nematoda belongs to a superphylum called the Ecdysozoa. These are all of the animals that molt a chitinous cuticle. We've talked about roundworms. Most of these groups don't contain parasitic members at all. There aren't any parasitic velvet worms. There aren't any parasites in the grouping called the Scalidophora. That includes priapulids and chinorynchs and other things that are pretty obscure. None of those are parasitic. But there is one smaller phylum that you'll encounter in Arkansas, and that's the Nematomorpha, the horsehair worms. There's about 320 species of those. The larvae are parasitic inside arthropods. The larvae look a little like acanthocephalans, although most people don't think they're closely related at all. The larvae do have a spiny introvert, and you might remember this is a body part that can be retracted and turned inside out, or extended and turned outside in, kind of like taking a sock and pulling it inside out and then pushing it outside out. And the introvert has spines on it. So the larvae look kind of like acanthocephalans, even though they aren't. The adults are very long and thin, giving rise to the name horsehair worm because they can be up to 1 meter long and 1 millimeter in diameter. There's an old superstition that if you soak a horsehair in water, it will turn into a snake. This doesn't actually happen. I've tried. But it's probably based on seeing nematomorph worms, which do look a little bit like an animated hare. They can be that thin because the adults don't have a functional gut. They emerge from their hosts, reproduce, and then die. There's 5 species in a class called Nectonematoidea that are marine parasites that infect crabs and lobsters and things like that. There's body parts of a dissected, can't tell what it is, maybe a crab. And that stuff that looks like dark spaghetti in the middle is nectonematoids that have been removed. Nectonematoids have a double row of bristles. They're called natatory, which means they're used for swimming. The freshwater nematomorphs, called the gordioids, seen on the left, don't have those bristles. And like I said, they look like very long, animated, swimming hairs. Females lay strands of millions of eggs. In particular, this is one you can sometimes find on submerged branches and things like that. These are the eggs of the horsehair worm Chordotes. And you can see how she's laid them back and forth and back and forth and back and forth in this very regular zigzag pattern. So those white zigzags that you're seeing, that's eggs of a horsehair worm. The eggs get eaten by a wide range of scavengers. They can be eaten by insect larvae. They can be eaten by snails. The larvae feed inside. Over on the left, that's a larva. And eventually they will form a dormant stage in the host tissues called a cyst. And there's a cyst on the right. There's a diagram of one of these larvae. They've got a ringed cuticle. It's said to be annulated. Looks a little like the Michelin Man. And a body divided into a preseptum and postseptum, and the preseptum has an introvert. The introvert's the little spiny thing that you can see sticking out at the right in the photo of a larva at the lower right. So then what? Well, the host has to get eaten by another host. So whatever insect or snail contains these cysts has to get eaten by something else. And this is typically a scavenging insect. Crickets will get this. Grasshoppers will get this. Beetles and cockroaches will. The larvae will hatch from their cysts and burrow into the host body cavity. They'll develop into adults inside there. And then when they're mature, they will emerge from their host with a rather traumatic effect. There you've got a grasshopper. That brown thing sticking out of its butt is a nematomorph called Spinochordodes. And there's actually several species that will affect host behavior. An infected cricket or grasshopper will seek out water and jump into the water. And of course, it drowns itself. But the parasites emerge in the water where they can swim around, reproduce, lay eggs, and die. Remember that as adults, they don't feed. As they mate, individuals can aggregate and form these knots. So there you've got a knot of horsehair worms. The name of this group, the Gordioidea, you might know that in Greek legend, there was a city whose gates were protected by an extremely complex knot. And there was a prophecy that whoever could untie the Gordian knot would become the city's ruler. And then Alexander the Great showed up and promptly chopped right through it with his sword and took over the city. So the Gordian knot refers to an extremely complicated knot. And that's the origin of this taxon, Gordioidea. Refers to an extremely complicated knot, like that. Males end in that's a male on the right. The tail ends in a pair of lobes that are used to grasp the female. Females may have lobes, or like the one on the left, the female posterior just may be a lot more blunt. I know a couple of years ago, Dave DeSword showed me one of the insects that he'd caught had some kind of huge worm emerging from it. And I think we finally decided it was a nematomorph worm, but it was actually hard to tell the difference between this, a nematomorph worm, and a myrmithid nematode. You might remember those also emerge from host insect butts and are used in biological control. I think we finally decided what we had was a nematomorph worm. And you do occasionally see these, often in the spring, in puddles and ponds and things like that. So we do get this group around here. As far as I know, they're not useful from a human perspective. They don't parasitize anything that humans are trying to get rid of. I don't think we use these in biological control. But nonetheless, they're a part of the greater whole and a part of the grand ecosystem, and worthy of study for that reason, if nothing else. And I will now stop the recording.